Story 4 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock. Story 4. The Spectre of Barracon. In the early autumn of 1870 I was called to the bar after a long course of study, and at once installed myself in chambers in the Middle Temple, London. Naturally, I was full of enthusiasm, and felt proud of being able to at last call myself barrister at law. Of course, I thought, as all young fellows do, that I had only to write up my name on the lintels of my door for business to flow in. But equally, of course, I was doomed to disappointment, and weeks rolled away, but never a brief came to me. My parents at this time were residing temporarily at a little paradise of a place called Oneglia, on the Italian Riviera, and with them was my only and idolized sister, Etty, one of the sweetest, dearest, and most beautiful girls the light of heaven's sun ever shone upon. Etty and I, being only children, doted upon each other, and between us there was the most perfect confidence and affection. She was a robust, merry, laughing girl, barely 20 years of age, and was destined then, as we all thought, to become a proud and happy wife in the course of a couple of years. She was engaged to be married to a young fellow who had already distinguished himself in the Indian diplomatic service, and was at that time a member of an important commission that had been sent to the Emir of Afghanistan. He was the representative of an old South Country family, and his people, the Chetwynds, and mine, had long been intimately acquainted. Tom Chetwynd had known Etty from the time they were children, and long before there was any formal engagement, he had regarded her as his future wife. He was 5 years her senior, and after a distinguished career at college, had received an appointment on the staff of Lord Blank, then Governor-General of India, and the future seemed to hold for him all that man could desire. He had already been absent 2 years, and at the expiration of another 2 years he was to return home, marry my sister, and take her back to India. To say that Etty loved him would, after all, be but a conventional way of putting it. As a matter of fact, it would be difficult to convey an adequate idea how deep and all-absorbing that love was. It was not merely an emotional passion, an infatuation that time would subdue or destroy, but love in its most exalted phase. It was love that found its expression in perfect confidence, perfect admiration, and yet it was tempered with a recognition that human nature is full of weakness and flaws, and that after all earthly love, however near it might approach man's standard of perfection, was but a faint foreshadowing of the love which will endure when time shall have become eternity. To Etty, Tom Chetwynd was a hero, at whose feet she was content to sit in worshipful admiration, and who would ultimately lead her to that everlasting happiness that the world cannot give. It will be said that this is the dream of every young girl who is engaged to be married. In a certain sense that may be true, for marriage, as viewed by the maiden, is not without its romance. But Etty's was not merely a romantic dream. Sober judgment begot in her rooted conviction. While I was conscious of all this, I was no less conscious that Tom idolized and adored my sister. He was clever, brilliant, staunch as steel, and the fear of 20 deaths could not have bought his honor. That was beyond price. I may, in passing, say my father was a dilettante, with ample means to indulge his tastes, and that he had taken my mother to Italy for the benefit of her health. I had promised to join them in December, and stay until the New Year with them. dear Eddie's last words to me as the train steamed out of Charing Cross being, "Now remember, Jack, you are to spend Christmas with us." Then she waved her hand, and her sweet face was a picture of beaming happiness. Alas, little did I think that when next I saw it, the smiles and happiness were to be but memories. My plans for going to Oneglia in December were frustrated by a matter which, from a professional point of view, I could not afford to neglect. It happened that in the course of November a firm of solicitors, old friends of my father, gave me my first brief. It was rather an important civil action in which I had some chance of distinguishing myself, and therefore I was anxious to devote every possible attention to it. The cause dragged on its length through December, and was then adjourned for the Christmas holidays, and though this freed me for a week or 10 days, I felt that the time was too short to journey so far as Italy. There was, therefore, nothing for it but to bear my disappointment as best I could. One evening, just before Christmas, I was sitting in my chambers bewailing the circumstances which prevented my being with my parents and sister at Christmas, for this was the first time in my life I had ever been absent from them at that period of the year, when my friend Archie Campbell was announced. Archie and I had been fellow students, and were very much attached. He, like myself, had an only sister to whom he had long been anxious to introduce me, with a view, as he jokingly yet half seriously put it, of making a match. "Maggie's a sweet wee bit thing," he used to say, "and you'll fall over head and ears in love with her directly you see her." Archie was a clever, bright lad, with a breeziness and freshness about him that reminded one of his own heather-clad hills. As he burst into my room with a cheery laugh, and grasped my hand in his vigorous, honest way, he exclaimed, "Look here, old fellow, I'm off to Scotland tomorrow to spend Christmas and New Year with my people, and I'm going to drag you down to Barracon with me. There's no excuse, you know. You can spare a week, anyway, and I'm not going to lose this chance of introducing you to Maggie. She's a sonsie bit lass, and though Barracon's a gloomy enough place outside, I'll warrant me you'll meet with a thorough good Scotch welcome inside. Besides, we're in the very heart of a fox-hunting country, and you'll be able to get a spin or two." "Well, Archie," I returned, "it's hard for me to resist the opportunity of making Maggie's acquaintance, but the fact is I must read up during the brief recess, and—" "Not a bit of it," he cried. "I've already written to say I should bring you down, so pray don't disappoint the old folks." Need I say, I yielded, the fact being I needed but little persuasion, for it would compensate me in some measure for not going to Oneglia. And then I must frankly confess I was desirous of knowing Maggie, for I had seen her photograph, and I thought to myself, if she is only half as winsome as her picture indicates, she's worth knowing. The result was Archie and I started the following evening, which was Christmas Eve, for the north, and arrived at our destination about noon on Christmas Day. Barracon was situated between Greenock and Wemyss Bay, and for generations had been in the possession of the Campbells. It was a strange, gloomy place. It must have been ghostly and gloomy enough in the summer sunlight, but as I saw it on that cheerless winter day, with the surrounding trees shivering in the icy wind, and the white mists wreathing themselves about it, while the landscape and the sky wore a neutral tint of leaden grey, it looked like the abode of melancholy itself. It was an old, castellated mansion that had been built in the days when strength of walls was necessary for self-protection. The approach was by a carriage drive through a dark wood now all dripping and dismal, while the ground was covered with sere and sodden leaves. Then an arched gateway gave entrance to a paved courtyard that was so overshadowed by a giant oak tree that grew in one corner that it was inconceivably dismal. The walls were damp and green with mold and fungus growths. The door was black oak, studded with iron and sunk deeply in the wall, and was somehow suggestive of the entrance to a sepulchre. A manservant had been sent to meet us with a dog-cart, and as we had arrived somewhat before our time, this ponderous oak door was closed. Nothing seemed to be stirring, and the horses' hoofs rattling on the stones seemed to reverberate in strange, hollow echoes. I was deeply impressed with the air of settled gloom that hung over the place, and I must have betrayed this, for as Archie sprang out of the cart, he said, "I told you the outside was dismal, but you'll find the inside all right." He pulled the chain attached to a large iron bell suspended from an iron stanchion let into the wall, and the clapper clashed and clanged with startling sharpness. In a few moments the door was flung open, and a young girl with a peal of joyous laughter bounded down the steps and flung her arms round Archie's neck. Then, remembering that she was in the presence of a stranger, she released him and stood blushing before me, and my friend at once introduced me to Maggie. Her photograph had not belied her. In fact, it had not done her justice, for it did not depict the mass of bright, wavy, golden hair, the languid blue eyes, the rosy health flush in her sweet face, nor the expression of happiness and sweetness that beamed in her countenance. Well might her brother describe her as a sonsie lassie. She was that in its truest sense. I found myself shaking her hand as if we had been old friends. In fact, she said, "You know, I cannot look upon you as a stranger, Mr. Kingsley, for I have heard so much about you from my brother." "Nor do I look upon you as a stranger, Miss Maggie," I returned, "for Archie has made me well acquainted with you from description, and he has also permitted me to see your photograph, which, however, I may truthfully say fails to do justice to the original." She blushed and laughed, and then led the way into the house, and a servant was at once summoned to show me to my room. It was an oblong room with a panelled ceiling and oak panelling round the walls. It was lighted by two long, narrow windows, and at one end was a huge fireplace with a ponderous carved oak mantelpiece. Over this hung the full-length portrait of a stern-looking man in the costume of a gentleman of the 15th century. 2 or 3 less noticeable portraits hung round the room, and a bull-hide shield and 2 claymores also hung on one of the panels. The bedstead was a massive 4-post antique piece of furniture, quite in keeping with the dark oak panelling and darker oak floor. The rest of the furniture was all of carved oak and antiquated. Nevertheless, there was an air of comfort about the place, for a great log burned brightly on the hearthstone, and the snowy linen of the bed and dressing tables relieved the somberness of the black oak. When I went downstairs, I was ushered into a cheerful room scarcely less antiquated, however, than my bedroom, and here I was introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Campbell, both of them stately and courtly, as became their race and position. "Our residence will no doubt strike you, Mr. Kingsley, as being somewhat cold and gloomy," remarked my host with a pronounced northern accent. "But I venture to say we know how to make our friends welcome and comfortable." There were a number of guests besides myself in the house, but I was the only one who could claim no relationship with the family. They were all either aunts, uncles, cousins, half-cousins, or cousins 6 or 7 times removed. In spite of my being so utterly a stranger, however, I was soon made to feel perfectly at home by the heartiness of the welcome that was accorded me. Having got over the first feeling of gloominess with which the strange old building impressed one, at any rate impressed me, I found myself studying the place with keen interest, for I was by instinct an antiquarian, and particularly fond of old buildings. And further than this, I found myself studying Maggie, and involuntarily, as it were, seeking to monopolize her company and conversation. She was bright as a sunbeam, and truly like a sunbeam in this house, relieving the gloom by her ringing laughter and sweet smiles. After dinner she asked me if I would like to see over the mansion, and I at once expressed a very strong desire to do so. "Especially," I added, "if you are to be my cicerone." She laughed merrily, and away we went upstairs and downstairs, along corridors, past angles, through dismal passages, until we gained the western wing of the building, where a large window at the end of a long corridor commanded a magnificent view that stretched away across a deep and well-wooded depression to a skyline of softly rounded hills. She called my particular attention to this view, saying that they were all very proud of it, and considered it the lion of their house. After this she led me into a long, narrow, and lofty room known as the Shield Room. It was oak-lined and oak-floored, with many carved panels, and a very curious chimney-piece carved with grotesque subjects. A few portraits hung round the walls, together with some shields, a steel breastplate behind, and pair of steel gauntlets, a number of antlers of deers, and a few old blunderbusses. At the western end of the room was a stained-glass window, and the light falling through this made a stain on the carpetless floor like a pool of blood. The gloaming was deepening, although a shaft of wild, angry light from the sullen west, where a rack of storm clouds hung, smote the window and made that stain on the floor look awfully real. It was about as ghostly a room, under the circumstances, as one could imagine, and turning to my companion, I said jokingly, "Of course, Miss Maggie, such a house as this is not without its ghost?" My question, asked thoughtlessly and lightly, had a strange effect upon her. The color fled from her face. She looked nervous and glanced hastily about her. Then, in a subdued, frightened tone, she answered, "Hush! Let us go." As I could not then attach any importance to her manner or remark, I burst into a laugh and exclaimed, "Surely you are not so superstitious as to—" Then I suddenly checked myself, for the earnestness of her manner and her serious tone commanded my respect, as, interrupting me, she said, "Excuse me, Mr. Kingsley, but we Scotch people have a greater faith in the unseen than your countrymen. In my own family there is indisputable record of—" She hesitated, as if reluctant to use the word, lest I might laugh, but after a pause continued, "Why should I not say at once of a spirit having visited us? But its presence in the house is an evil omen. It means death." A perceptible shudder passed over her. The shaft of light had been blotted out by the storm clouds. The crimson stain had faded, and gloom and silence filled the room. For a moment, but only for a moment, I was disposed to laugh, for I was so utterly without superstition myself that to hear this clever, intelligent girl talk of the presence of a ghost in the house, meaning death, seemed to me extravagantly comic. But, as I have said, the desire to laugh was momentary only, for the solemnity and gloominess of the room impressed me in an unaccountable way, and seeing she was affected, I offered her my arm and said, "Come, let us continue our exploration, Miss Maggie." The next few days were very pleasant and happy ones to me, and, short as the time was, I had come to regard Maggie Campbell as something more than a mere acquaintance. She seemed to me to embody all that is delightful in a woman, allied to a keen intelligence and great shrewdness. The weather, which was dry and frosty, if not particularly bright, enabled us to enjoy many pleasant rambles in the grand old woods around Barracon, and I could not close my eyes to the fact that Archie lost no opportunity to bring me and his sister together. Not that I objected. On the contrary, before the week had gone I began to think I was privileged to consider myself her very intimate friend, if not something nearer than a friend. Since our visit to the Shield Room on Christmas night, I had never alluded to the subject of the so-called spectre, although I had not forgotten it. It had an interest for me, in so far as it set me wondering how so intelligent and well-educated a girl as Maggie could have belief in such things. But as my stay was drawing to a close, I was determined once more to speak of it, in order that I might have a chance of trying to argue her out of what I then considered a nonsensical idea. Accordingly, I invited her to a stroll one afternoon, and we wandered in what was known as the cover. It was a stretch of somber pine wood, so filled with gloom and weirdness that it would have delighted the heart of Dante. "Miss Maggie," I began, "I should really like to know more about this family spectre of yours, and the time and place seem most fitting for you to tell me all about it." She looked at me scrutinizingly for some moments, as if to assure herself that I was not jesting, and being satisfied apparently that I was in earnest, she said with something like sadness and solemnity, "It is a serious matter to us, Mr. Kingsley, whatever you may think to the contrary. This phantom comes to us or to those we love to warn us or them of death and danger." "Do you mean death to those who see it?" I asked, scarcely able to keep my countenance. "No, but to someone connected with them." "Now, supposing," I said as I drew her gloved hand through my arm, "supposing this phantom, as you call it, were to appear to me, might I take it as a sign that your family, that you, regarded me with affection?" "You are my brother's attached friend," she answered prevaricatingly, and with averted face. But I saw by her reddened temples that she had not misunderstood me. "That scarcely answers my question," I returned. "But let us dismiss the phantom, and I will frankly tell you that before ever I came here Archie had frequently talked to me of you, and said that you would make a noble wife. He was right, and my desire is to be able in the process of time to look upon Archie as my brother. Do I speak in riddles?" "No," she murmured, "but we have known each other so short a time." "True, but still Archie and I are very old friends. He knows my people, my position, and something of my affairs. He has told me so much about you that I feel as if I had enjoyed your acquaintance for years instead of days, and I can truthfully declare that you have taken my heart from me." Her breath came quickly as, after a pause, she said in low tones, "But you have another in its place." "Yours?" I asked quickly. "Yes." We strolled back to gloomy old Barracon as lovers, and that night in the smoking room I said to Archie, "Well, old boy, I hope our two families will some day be united." "Well done, old fellow!" he cried joyfully, slapping me on the back. "Didn't I tell you that as soon as you saw Maggie you would fall over head and ears in love with her? Well, she's as bonny a lass as ever lived, and she'll be a treasure to you, though it's I, her brother, who say it." I went to my bedroom that night filled with pleasurable sensations and with many bright hopes for the future. It was a wild night, with a westerly gale blowing round the house, and, putting on my dressing gown, I drew a large, old-fashioned easy chair before the blazing log on the hearth, and took to dreaming about many things. Suddenly I started and turned sharply round, for I could have sworn I heard a sigh, but I saw nothing save the ghostly shadows which the firelight wrought upon the floor. The firelight was the only light I had, for I had put the lamp out. "Upon my word, this eerie old place is making me nervous," I murmured audibly as I turned the log over with the poker to produce a greater blaze. As I once more settled in my chair, I again heard that sigh, and so pronounced was it that I started to my feet and experienced a strange, nervous thrill that was totally new to me. "Pssh!" I said. "What absurdity!" And I was annoyed with myself for being startled. But at that instant there was a noise in the room, as if a bird was flying about. The sound seemed to travel with great rapidity from side to side, corner to corner, floor to ceiling. When I thought it was above me, it came from below. When I thought it was below, it came from above. Nothing was visible. There was nothing, so far as I could make out, that would in any way account for this delusion, if delusion it was. The sound was unmistakable, but what produced it? This strange noise from an unseen and unaccountable source was at once the weirdest and most uncanny thing I had ever experienced. And while I stood irresolute, trying to find some solution for the mystery, Something icily cold touched me at the back of the neck and caused me to shiver. This new sensation begot in me a sense of nervousness that I had never dreamed myself capable of. I struggled against the feeling, but could not resist it. I should not like to say that my sensations were altogether those of fear in the sense in which it is understood, but I was conscious of a shrinking within myself, as it were, a shrinking from an invisible something that had no name. In a few minutes the sounds ceased, and with my mind strangely disturbed, I resumed my seat and tried to account by rational laws for what I had heard, and at last I came to the conclusion it was due to some unconscious cerebration. The gloomy building and what Maggie had told me had made an impression all unknown to myself, and now, being alone on a stormy night in a very ghostly sort of room, my nervous system had made my senses victims of an auricular delusion. This was a sophistical mode of reasoning, but it satisfied me for a time, and I think I must have fallen asleep. At any rate, I suddenly sprang up with a start. The log had burnt to a handful of glowing charcoal. I felt cold and uneasy, with a sense of impending disaster. I was going to throw off my clothes and get into bed when I started. I may say literally reeled back, for between me and the bed was a luminous figure. In outline only was it suggestive of the human figure, and that figure a woman's. It was enveloped in a gauzy, diaphanous veil, the lower part of which faded away. The arms, when I first looked, were folded on the breast, but slowly and with indefinable grace one arm was gradually extended and pointed towards me, and with that act all my volition seemed to leave me. In obedience to some strange mesmeric influence, I moved mechanically to the door and opened it. Then the figure floated into the corridor, and once more I heard the sigh. Still under the spell, I followed. All was silent as the grave, as dark as Erebus, save for the faint, unearthly light emitted by the phantom. Still floating on, it led me through the intricate passages until at last I found myself at the end of that corridor where the window was, from which such an enchanting view was obtained. Here the figure vanished, and for some moments all was gloom. But gradually it seemed to me that over the landscape spread a singular phosphorescent glow that revealed every detail of the landscape, though in a misty, dim way. But it wasn't a landscape I knew. There were palm trees, deep jungles, and beyond, a sandy plain that stretched to illimitable space. And though it was so far off I saw, for my powers of vision seemed to annihilate distance, a man stretched upon the plain, and above him hovered a flock of vultures. His face was turned upward, and with a cry of horror I recognized it as the face of Tom Chetwynd, my sister's affianced husband. With this recognition all things faded out, and I have no recollection of how I got back to my room. But hours after, I found myself on the bed. It was broad daylight. I felt ill, nervous, and out of sorts, and when I had finished my toilet, I hurried downstairs. The family had already partaken of breakfast, and I was informed that the servant had knocked on my door 3 times without obtaining a response. As soon as ever I could get away, I asked Maggie to have a stroll with me, and when we were alone I turned to her and said, "Tell me, what form does this family spectre of yours take?" There was no mistaking my earnestness and seriousness, and as the color faded from her sweet face, she answered, "It generally makes itself heard by sighs, then by a noise like that made by a bird's wing, and lastly it reveals itself like a thing of faint luminosity, with some resemblance to a woman." I caught her hand excitedly and exclaimed, "My God! Then I have seen it, and it has shown me my sister's affianced husband lying dead upon a sandy plain." With a cry of fear, Maggie reeled, and would have fallen had I not caught her. But in a few moments she made an effort and recovered herself. And then, in pleading and pathetic tones, she said, "Oh, lose not a moment, but hurry to your dear sister and comfort her." Filled with a nameless dread, as I was, I could not disregard this injunction. 24 hours had wrought a great change in me, and I no longer scoffed at the incomprehensible. "I will go," I replied, as I caught Maggie in my arms, and for the first time kissed her. "You told me that this phantom only appeared to those you loved," I said. "Therefore, it is a sign that you love me, and that I love you, and our future is bound up together." She sighed in assent, and thus, under these strange and weird circumstances, we stood pledged to each other. 5 days later, without any previous announcement, I was in Oneglia. The astonishment of my people may be far better imagined than described. Never before, I thought, had I seen Etty looking so beautiful, so full of spirits and joyousness. If my awful vision was true, no shadow of the coming sorrow had touched her. I found considerable difficulty in accounting for my sudden and unexpected arrival. I think I made some lame excuse about not feeling very well and wanting a change. Next morning, a number of letters were handed to my father. I was present at the time. One was addressed in a handwriting that I instantly recognized. It was that of Mrs. Chetwynd. With a sudden impulse and a dire presentiment of coming evil, I snatched the letter up, tore it open, and read: "We are distracted. Brief news has come to us of the death of our beloved son Tom. We are without details, but so far as is known, he was attacked with some of his party by a band of marauding natives and foully murdered. God comfort us all, and God pity dear Etty. Break the news gently to her." As I read this, the room seemed to swim round me, and with a low moan I sank onto a sofa. "What is the matter?" asked my father in alarm. I handed him the letter, merely remarking, "I knew it all beforehand. It was revealed to me." When we were able to discuss the sad news, we decided that Etty should not be informed for some time. Knowing, as I did, how her life was bound up in Tom, I feared that the news would kill her. A little later I told her, with as much joyousness in my tone as I could assume, that since she left England I had become engaged to one of the dearest women heaven ever smiled upon, and I had a particular reason why she should return with me and make Maggie's acquaintance. Although she thought this precipitancy was totally unlike me, she consented, and we travelled back to London without break of journey. After a day's rest in the metropolis, during which I visited the Chetwynds and learned that there was no possible room to doubt the report of dear Tom's death, we left for Barrochan, and in a few hours Etty and Maggie were together. Then I felt some sense of relief, for only women know how to comfort women when the heart is crushed, and the infinite tenderness and sweetness of Maggie's nature rendered her peculiarly fitted for such a task. In the course of 2 or 3 days the girls had taken to each other as if they had been years acquainted. Then one night, as we sat in the firelight in the old dining-room, we gradually and gently told Etty that in the far-off land of northern India he for whom she hoped and longed was lying dead. Gently, as we broke the news, the shock was cruel, and for many weeks my beloved sister hovered between life and death. But an angel of pity and goodness tended her in the person of Maggie Campbell, and the infinite love and infinite tenderness of this dear creature nursed her wounded sister back to the things of life, though the joyous spirit and light-heartedness had gone forever. But when the balmy breath of spring was awakening nature around Barrochan, Etty was enabled to wander about with Maggie. She was quiet and subdued now, for the shadow of a never-ending sorrow was folded about her heart. "Jack," she said to me one evening, as we strolled in the deepening twilight along the terrace in front of Barrochan, "for me the world has grown grey, but for you it is full of rich things, and a great joy and infinite peace. And though I have lost, you have gained." She took my hand and placed it in that of Maggie's, and then left us. Years have passed since that evening, and Maggie has long been my wife. Etty is with us. She is a quiet, thoughtful, subdued woman, actuated by a prayerful earnestness to lessen the sorrow and assuage the anguish of her suffering fellow beings. Her own sorrow finds no vent in words, but it is written indelibly on her sweet face. Sometimes my thoughts wander back to that awful night at Barracon, and I ask myself whether I dreamed a dream or actually saw the phantom. But whichever it was, the result was the same, and by the timely warning I was enabled to save my dear sister from a shock that might have killed her. End of story number 4. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.
Story 5 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Losacco. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J.E. Muddock. Story 5. The Piper of Culloden. On a bold promontory, whose base was laved by the waters of the German Ocean, stood Drumslie Castle. It was a plain, rambling, solid building, of a nondescript style of architecture, and yet not out of keeping with the situation in which it was placed. Inland was a semicircular sweep of hills, rugged and barren in parts, in others clothed with dense pine forests that seemed to be the abiding places of the spirits of gloom. Between the base of these hills and the castle was a wild stretch of moorland, over which the seabirds wheeled in darkening flight, filling the air with their plaintive cries. It was a solitary place in summer, when the broad beams of the sun flung a golden light over the sepia-toned landscape. The drowsy hum of bees, the lowing of kine, the rustling of the marsh sedges, or the cry of birds were about the only sounds one heard. Occasionally a dust-stained pedestrian toiled his way amongst the scrunty heather coming from the hills to the sea, or vice versa, or a ragged but picturesque shepherd roamed in dreamy indolence with his browsing flocks. Otherwise all was solitude, a solitude that seemed to lie far, far beyond the fret of the passionate world. But it was also a meeting place for the wanton airs of heaven, and when the storm wind came across the German Ocean and swept the moorland, it was then a region of desolation, a fitting haunt for things weird and uncanny, and a fostering school for the wild stories and legends current in the district. Drumslie Castle was hoary with time, for it was built in a far-off age, and had had a strange and checkered career. But soon after the fatal fight of Culloden, it passed into the possession of the family of Linning, for services rendered to the English government under the Duke of Cumberland. In connection with the castle was a considerable rent roll derived from property in and about the town, which nestled in a deep depression that sloped down to the sea 2 miles away. This town was a thriving, busy place, but, owing to its situation in a hollow, it was entirely hidden from the moorland, a thin veil of smoke alone indicating its presence to the traveller over the moor. A well-kept road that was carried along the edge of the cliffs connected the town and the castle, which, at the time we are writing of, was in possession of Sir Archibald Linning, a lineal descendant of the Sir John Linning, who had fought under Cumberland at Culloden. Sir Archibald was not an old man. Indeed, he was some years under 50, but he was grizzled and careworn, with a look of pained anxiety in his face. He had married somewhat early in life, and his lady had borne him a goodly number of sons and daughters. But he had seen them taken from him one by one, nearly all by violent, mysterious, or sudden death, for a curse rested upon the house of Linning. Now we find Sir Archibald old before his time, and a widower with only one daughter, Jessie. The Linnings had ever been noted for their beauty. Tradition had it that an ugly woman or a misshapen man had never been known in the family, and certainly, as far as Jessie was concerned, this tradition appeared to receive verification. Cast in a mould that might without exaggeration be called perfection, and with a face full of that feminine softness and sweetness beloved of the old painters, she was a woman who would have tempted good St. Anthony himself to his fall, and allied to this physical perfection was a gentleness of disposition and a generous nature, open, frank, and honest. She had from her earliest years enjoyed the best of health, for the Linnings were famed for robustness no less than beauty, and now, having reached the age of 23, it appeared as if she was destined to long life, and to become the founder of a new branch of the Linning family. On her, indeed, her father had set his last earthly hopes. To her he looked to perpetuate his race, and he had prayed with an earnestness begotten of wild despair that heaven would spare this girl, and that the curse which had all but annihilated his people might now end. For a considerable time she had been residing with some distant relatives in London, and while there had been introduced to Roland Staffler, himself a doctor, and second son of the world-renowned surgeon, Sir Joseph Staffler. Almost at the first time of seeing each other they fell in love, and in every way they seemed singularly fitted to journey together through life. When Sir Archibald heard of the love-making he was truly glad, for though he had no personal acquaintance at that time with the Stafflers, he knew they were people beyond reproach, and no less renowned for their chivalry and honour than for their cleverness. Great was his joy, therefore, at the prospect of a union between his house and the Stafflers, as by it he hoped that his own house would be saved. For 6 months the course of the wooing ran on smoothly and happily, and at last Jessie returned to her home to make preparations for her marriage. Up to this period Sir Archibald had not seen his future son-in-law, but it was arranged that before the summer had waned Roland was to visit Drumslie Castle, and be Sir Archibald's guest for at least a couple of months. Professional duties, however, kept the young doctor from fulfilling his engagement until the summer had passed, and he arrived at Drumslie one sombre afternoon towards the end of October. Had he been by nature prone to receive gloomy impressions from external objects, he could not have failed to be affected as he drove up to the ancient castle, for turn which way the eye would, there was not an atom of colour to relieve the monotint of grey. The grey sea blended with the grey sky, and the grey moorland lost itself in the grey mist-swept hills beyond. The only thing that did tend to break the monotony of tone was the bog cotton, which flashed out in white patches here and there on the moor. From somewhere out of the misty distance came the mournful bleat of a sheep now and then, and this was varied by the bay of the heathcock or the lonely whew of the plover. The infinite dolefulness of the scene was accentuated by the leaden sky that seemed to spread over the vast land and seascape like a funeral pall. From the sea itself came a sullen boom as it rose and fell with rhythmical monotony against the iron cliffs. Sir Archibald met the doctor in the entrance hall, and taking both his hands, gave him a warm welcome, saying with a smile that had something of the sadness of the external landscape in it, "Right glad I am to see you, and I give you a treble welcome as my hoped-for son. I trust that you may bring joy and peace and happiness to my house." "I hope so, sir, answered the doctor with a hearty laugh, "as I shall take peace and joy and happiness from it." The latter part of this answer, as will be readily seen, was capable of being contorted into a meaning totally different to that intended by the speaker, and some such interpretation as this must have occurred to Sir Archibald, for he raised his shoulders with a shudder, and said mournfully, "Heaven forbid that you should take joy and happiness from my desolated home." Then, as if suddenly remembering himself, he laughed, and added quickly, "But come, I must not talk like this now. Jessie is eager to see you, and the servant will at once conduct you to your apartment, so that you may change your travelling dress, by which time dinner will be served." The doctor failed to notice in his host's face the settled gloom which was there. He was too full of thoughts of his lady love, and hastened to his room with a light heart. The days sped merrily with the young couple, who were too much absorbed in each other to interest themselves in anything else. Jessie, of course, was not ignorant of the curse which was said to rest upon her house, nor that she was the last prop of that house. But the prospect of joy in the near future caused her for the time to forget the sorrow and the pain of the past. Not so her father. He could not conceal his anxiety lest even at the 11th hour his new-born hopes should be blighted, as they had ever been blighted throughout his life. But as day after day went by, and he watched his daughter and her affianced husband, as he saw how infinitely tender he was to her, and how she with all her woman's nature adored him, he began to think that at last the sorrow had ended. But alas, this elusive dream was to be of short duration. It chanced one evening that he and Dr. Staffler were seated together in the library, Jessie being engaged in superintending preparations for a party on the following day, a number of friends and acquaintances having been invited to meet the doctor. It had been a singularly sullen day, and the sea boomed with angry menace, while the wind had moaned dismally over the moorland. As the darkness gathered, there was a wild streak of blood-red light in the west, where the heavy clouds were banked up over the hills. Sir Archibald had predicted a stormy night, and with the deepening gloom the boom of the sea grew hoarser, and great splashes of rain were driven against the windows. The library, however, was cheerful enough. A sea-coal fire blazed brightly, and its ruddy gleams warmed the dark oak of the panelling, and added colour to the bindings of the many volumes in the well-filled bookcases. The windows, which faced seaward, were screened with massive crimson velvet curtains, and a heavy dark red pile carpet covered the floor. Outside, the storm had gathered in fury, and blowing in from the ocean, the wind brought squalls of hail and rain that beat with extraordinary force against the window. But Sir Archibald was unusually cheerful, for he and the doctor had been discussing the approaching marriage, and settling certain weighty matters indispensable to the union of two important families. There had come a lull in the conversation, when suddenly the doctor started up in an attitude of listening. "What is it?" asked his host quickly as he noticed this. "Well, I could almost have sworn that I heard the sound of bagpipes swelling and dying down on the wind." With a cry that was a wail of abject despair, Sir Archibald sank back in his chair, his chin fell on his breast, and his face assumed a hue that was literally ashen in its tone. Thinking that he had been seized with a fit of apoplexy, the doctor sprang to him, grasped his wrist to feel the pulse, and in a voice of anxiety asked him what was the matter. "The bagpipes! The bagpipes!" gasped Sir Archibald, whilst his eyes had a wild, staring expression in them. "But surely the sound of bagpipes needn't disturb you like this," the doctor remarked, naturally greatly surprised. "It's the Piper of Culloden," gasped Sir Archibald hoarsely. "Well, really, sir, this requires some explanation," said the doctor, with a puzzled air. "You shall have it! You shall have it!" groaned the afflicted man as he covered his face with his hands and shuddered visibly. "But go to your seat! Go to your seat!" Dr. Staffler went back to his chair, and for some minutes there was silence in the room, and then could be heard, coming and going with the wind, the sound of bagpipes, now wailing plaintively, now swelling to a warlike pibroch, and anon scraughing fiercely, and yet there was something unnatural in the sounds. It is difficult to say in what way this made itself manifest, but that it did so was proved by the doctor saying rather to himself than as if by speaking to his companion, "There is something awfully weird about that music." "My God, yes!" exclaimed Sir Archibald, clasping his hands in an agony of despair. "Awfully weird, because it means death to a member of my house." The doctor looked incredulous, and even smiled, for he was utterly without superstition. "Surely," he remarked, "such an idea as that is unworthy a man of your intelligence." A laugh of fear escaped from the white lips of Sir Archibald as he replied, "You will not say that when I have told you the meaning of those awful sounds." Then he suddenly sprang from his seat, and seizing the doctor's hand almost roughly, he exclaimed, "Come here," at the same time drawing him towards an anteroom and lifting a lamp from the table. The door of the anteroom was screened by a curtain, and letting go the doctor's hand, he pulled this curtain on one side and entered. He raised the lamp above his head so that its rays fell full on the portrait of a soldier in costume of the early part of the 17th century. "That man," he said fiercely, "was an ancestor of mine. He was a captain under the Duke of Cumberland, and fought at Culloden. It was through him that this curse came upon our house." He uttered a groan as he said this, and passed hurriedly out of the room again, as if the sight of the portrait was hateful to him. Once more he threw himself into his chair, and covering his face, groaned in anguish. The doctor, who had followed him, began seriously to think that his host was not in his right mind, and he said persuasively, "Perhaps I had better summon some of the servants who will assist you to your bedroom, where I will visit you, and if you will permit me I will prescribe something that will have the effect of soothing your nerves." Sir Archibald looked up. His face was haggard and ghastly. His eyes were expressive of intense mental distress, and when he spoke his voice was hoarse as a raven's. "Keep your seat," he said. "You are wrong in your diagnosis. For me those dreadful sounds which you yourself have heard are fraught with an awful meaning, and it is only right that I, as a man of honour, should tell you what that meaning is. You see me a desolate old man, old before my time. One by one, my beloved children have been taken from me in the prime and flush of life, and not from fell disease, but while apparently in vigorous health. And always before the death of one of my children, the sounds of those awful pipes have been heard." The doctor himself grew a little pale at these words in spite of himself, for, if they were not the mere ravings of a mind distraught, they meant that his bride-elect was doomed. It was a dreadful thought, and then, as if ashamed and even angry with himself, he laughed a scornful little laugh, and ejaculated the one word, "Absurd!" "You are sceptical," said Sir Archibald in the same hollow tone. "But heaven pity us! It is too true, too true. My ancestor, whose portrait you have just looked upon, was a soldier of great bravery, but a fierce and passionate man. It is said that in his passion he was capable of almost any cruelty. On that fatal day of Culloden he held a commission in Monro's regiment, and it is stated that he fought with lion-like bravery. When the dreadful charge of the wild, rushing Highlanders was over, when all that despair and devotion could do for the misguided Prince Charlie was seen to be of no avail, his beaten remnant of an army began to fall back sullenly, though even as they retired they contested the ground inch by inch, and in many cases pouring out their lifeblood rather than own defeat. My ancestor was one of the most active and determined in following up the slowly retreating Highlandmen, and all reports concur in saying that he was relentless to those who would not readily yield. On one part of the field lay a wounded piper. One of his legs had been shattered by a cannonball, so that he was helpless. His pipes were beside him, and he was stretched on his back, writhing with pain. A little group of his ragged countrymen were slowly falling back before a superior number of the English, who were led by my ancestor. Suddenly the dying piper rose, and seizing his instrument, he blew a wild war strain to encourage his kin against the hated foe. The sound of the pipes so inspirited the flying column that they suddenly turned with savage fury on their pursuers, and for some minutes a bloody hand-to-hand encounter ensued, and many an Englishman bit the dust. "Cease that cursed row!" roared my ancestor to the wounded piper. But the man, all unheeding, played louder and more fiercely. Such an unequal struggle could not last long, for the Englishmen outnumbered the Scots 2 to 1. At last the remnant of the latter turned and fled. Then, wild with passion, as he saw how many of his men had fallen in that short scrimmage that had been brought about by the pibroch of the wounded piper, my ancestor rushed upon him, and crying out, "Thou accursed fool!" he plunged his sword through the man's body. But the Highlander was not killed outright, and raising himself on his elbow as the blood gushed in a stream from his wound, he retorted, "Accursed be thou and all thy tribe to the 4th generation. Thy descendants shall die in their shoes, and while the bloom of youth and health is upon them. My pipes shall announce their doom, and whenever the pibroch sounds in their ears, death shall be stretching his hands towards them. Again I say, accursed, thrice accursed, be thou and thine and thy descendants to the 4th generation." In his fierce wrath, the piper almost sprang to his feet, and, as if to emphasize his dying hatred, he spat in my ancestor's face, and then blew a wild skirl on his pipes. But it was his last act, for the next moment he was brained, and fell back dead, and then my ancestor hacked the offending pipes to pieces with his sword. Such, then, is the story, and the curse of the dying piper has been too literally fulfilled. I have heard that unearthly music often, and whenever I have heard it, I have seen one of my loved ones taken from me. Sir Archibald had told this strange story in a quick, jerky, nervous way. His eyes depicted terror, and his face was like the face of a corpse. Dr. Staffler was naturally much affected, although he did not attach any serious importance to what he had heard. Or rather, it should be said, he tried not to do so, but in spite of himself an uneasy feeling forced itself upon him. There was no mistake about his having heard the pipes, but he asked himself whether his ears had not been befooled, or if that was not the case, whether the music he had heard had not been played by a living man. He succeeded in persuading his host to go to bed, where he administered to him a sleeping draught, and the next morning, when Sir Archibald arose, he was much refreshed, although gloomy and despondent. A fortnight passed, and Dr. Staffler began to laugh at the fears he had allowed to take possession of him on that stormy night when he had heard the so-called Piper of Culloden. Jessie had not been told of the incident, and the young couple were very happy in their love. The doctor was proud of his affianced wife, and was never tired of praising her beauty. For beautiful she was, and to his eyes her beauty was without parallel. But while the young people were thus dreaming their dreams of future joy and happiness, Sir Archibald was filled with nervous anxiety, so that his haggard face had become still more haggard. He could not forget the warning. But what he hoped and prayed was that the warning might be meant for himself, not for his child. He was a worn man, to whom life had proved very bitter, and he would have no difficulty in yielding it up. But it was torture to him to think that his idolized child was doomed. She was so beautiful, so full of health and hope, and so supremely happy at the prospect of becoming the wife of the man she worshipped. It wanted now but 3 weeks to the marriage, which was to take place in London, and the doctor, Sir Archibald, and his daughter were to leave for the south in the course of a few days. Jessie was in high spirits and busy with preparations for her departure from her home and for her marriage. Once again the doctor and his host were alone in the library. It was a beautiful night, calm, cold, and clear. The stars in frosty splendour burned, and a nearly full moon silvered the sleeping sea. Sir Archibald drew back the curtain from the window in order that the doctor might gaze upon the superb scene that, while beautiful, looked almost unearthly under the moonlight. Suddenly there arose on the gentle air that came in from the sea the sound of bagpipes, not a fierce pibroch this time, but a low, plaintive, melancholy wail that seemed to be softened and subdued by distance, so faint were the sounds. Sir Archibald let the curtain fall, and staggering backwards to his chair he gasped, "The pipes! The pipes! The curse is still on us!" The doctor tried to soothe him, saying, "Really, sir, I think you should not let this matter affect you so much." Sir Archibald turned his eyes upon the doctor, with a look of despair and reproach, but he made no response. Then he sank back in his chair, and seemed to be wrapped in gloomy thought. The doctor took down a book, and seating himself began to read, although he found that he could not concentrate his mind upon the page, but his thoughts would wander to the strange story his host had told him about the Piper of Culloden. Presently Jessie came into the room. She was looking a little pale, and her lover's perception and anxiety being quickened by what he had heard, he asked, "Are you not well, Jess?" "Oh yes, dear. Well, that is, I have been suffering from a slight headache," she answered with a smile. "Oh, I will soon give you something to relieve that," said the doctor, rising from his seat. "I have already taken something," she answered, laying her soft white hand on his. "Have you? What have you taken?" "Well, your little medicine case that you were showing me the other day was on the dining room sideboard, and I helped myself to some sal volatile." "And has it done you good?" asked the doctor. "Not yet. There has hardly been time." The doctor drew a chair near the fire for her, and seating himself beside her, began to discuss the merits of certain musical composers, for they were both very fond of music, and while he talked she grew paler, and seemed to become abstracted, and presently she said faintly, "Roland, I feel very queer. There's something the matter with me." With those words Sir Archibald uttered a cry of woe and swooned away. The servants were summoned, and he was put to bed, and in wild alarm the doctor plied his sweetheart with questions as to her symptoms. "I have a strange numbness of the lips," she answered, "and I feel pain." That statement made him turn giddy and almost reel, for the distinct and characteristic symptom, numbness of the lips, pointed to poisoning with aconite, of which he knew he had a small phial in his case. He rushed into the dining room, examined the case, and found that the aconite bottle was half empty. By mistake the poor girl had taken the poison for the sal volatile. Gradually she grew worse, and servants were started off post haste to obtain the services of other doctors, and all through that dreadful night Roland Staffler, almost distracted with grief, did everything that human skill and science could suggest, in conjunction with colleagues from far and near, but all was of no avail. The dreadful poison had got too firm a hold, and as the eastern light of morn spread itself over the still sleeping sea, the beautiful Jessie Linning, in a fit of wild delirium, passed into the land of shadows. Crushed into the very dust with an unutterable sorrow, the poor young doctor bowed his head over the body of her he had loved so well, and felt that henceforth his life must be a broken life, a life of gloom. He had at first brought joy and peace and happiness to that accursed place, but now, alas, through inadvertence he had taken peace and joy and happiness away, in a different sense from what he had hoped for. Sir Archibald Linning never recovered from the blow, but 3 months afterwards he followed his daughter to the grave, and the night before he died, the wailing music of the pipes of the Piper of Culloden came breathing over the sea. The curse has been truly fulfilled. The last of the Linnings is extinct. Drumslie Castle has fallen into a roofless ruin. The owl hoots through its silent chambers, and the ravens build their nests in the adjoining trees. Roland Staffler has gained eminence in his profession, and his name is known far and wide as a scientific man. But since that fatal night when Jessie Linning, his affianced bride, was poisoned at Drumslie Castle, he has never been known to smile. His life has indeed been a broken life, through that curse uttered long ago by the dying Piper of Culloden. End of Story 5. Recording by Mark Losacco.
Story 6 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Gallagher. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J.E. Muddock. Story number 6, Some Experiments with a Head, being a record from the papers of a late physician. The following notes have reference to a time now far off, alas, when I was a very young man and imbued with an unquenchable desire for knowledge. I was an enthusiast, I freely admit, and there were some who called me a dreamer. But, if that is to be interpreted as meaning a visionary, I decline to admit that the term is applicable. I had a profound love of science in all its branches, and in those fields of research which the scientist must conscientiously explore if he wishes to be accepted as a trustworthy guide, I diligently sought for demonstrable facts. Scientists may be divided into two very distinct classes, your men of theory and your men of practice. I preferred to fall into the latter category, and asked for proof of all that was advanced. It was this very trait in my character which led to the extraordinary incidents related in this paper. Let me at once state that at the time to which I refer, I was a medical student studying at the Collège de France in Paris. My father before me had been an eminent member of the medical profession, and from the very earliest period of my existence I evinced a strong desire to follow in his footsteps. The consequence was that, by the time I was 20, I was studying hard in the French capital. I had already passed several examinations with flying colors, and was looking forward to obtaining my diploma within the next 2 years. Now, there was one subject that had always possessed for me almost fascinating interest, and I am free to confess that it absorbed a great deal of my attention. It was whether in cases of decapitation, death was instantaneous. My professional brethren will know that opinions on the subject have been much divided, but instantaneous is an elastic term. The coming and going of a flash of lightning is said to be instantaneous, and yet it occupies an appreciable space of time that is capable of being accurately measured. Now, the question that suggested itself to my mind was whether, though life was extinguished in a space of time no longer than a flash of lightning takes to manifest itself, that is, in the blinking of an eye, there was still time for introspection, retrospection, and speculation. I was fully aware that the point involved was a peculiarly delicate one, and might be said to belong more to the domain of psychology rather than physiology. But in considering the subject, one could not ignore the experiences of those who had come within an ace of losing their lives by drowning. In well-authenticated instances, the drowning person had in an incredibly brief space of time traversed the whole record of his life, had recalled incidents of childhood long ago forgotten, and had even worked out speculatively what his friends would think of his death, how his affairs would be settled, and what would be the careers of his children, if he had any, in the far-off future. In such brief moments the mind is capable of grasping an extraordinary range of subjects, past, present, and to come, and yet the duration of consciousness in such cases can hardly exceed, in the extremest limit, 5 minutes. In dwelling upon these facts, I asked myself whether the brain of a decapitated person was not capable of thought for a period as correspondingly long as that experienced by a drowning man. I was, of course, aware that some of the most eminent anatomists affirm that the entire severance of the jugular vein, the carotid arteries, especially the interior carotid supplying the brain with blood, and the spinal cord, or main nerve tract of the body, must produce absolutely instantaneous death. But I had the boldness to answer to this that instantaneousness was capable of being measured as a space of time, and such a space of time to a dying man was filled with potentialities that could not be ignored by the inquirer who had a due regard for minutiae. Nor could I forget the well-authenticated case of an unfortunate victim of the Reign of Terror, whose head was seized by the executioner as soon as the guillotine had severed it, and as the man was in the act of holding it up by the hair to the view of the crowd, he saw the eyes turn upon him with such a look of anguish and unspeakable reproach that with a cry of horror he let the head fall and fled. The professorial chair of anatomy in the college was filled by the celebrated Dr. Francois Grassard, who had been a friend of my father and took a great interest in me. He was pleased at times to discuss my favorite subject with me, but his opinion was that cessation of thought and power of reflection was absolutely coincident with the severance of the neck, which, as everyone knows in the case of the guillotine, is as quick as the blinking of the eye. But then I took my stand upon that elasticity of the term instantaneous, and which, as I have already urged, while counting for nothing in an ordinary way, might be much to a dying person, that is, a person dying by a sudden and violent means. On one occasion, after an argument with Dr. Grassard, I ventured to suggest that it might be possible to make some practical experiments with a view to substantiating or disproving my argument. The doctor reflected a little time, and then said, "Yes, I think it is possible, and such experiments can hardly fail to be deeply interesting and even scientifically valuable." It was not until nearly a year after this that the opportunity for the suggested experiments occurred. It happened that about this time Paris was startled by a wholesale butchery of a peculiarly atrocious character. In one of the wretched dens of the Rue de Cascade, a man named Gaspard Thoreau hacked his wife, his mistress, and 4 children to pieces. The Rue de Cascade is situated in the neighborhood of Saint-Denis, which is perhaps one of the foulest spots to be found in any city in the world. It is not necessary to dwell upon the details of the crime, which, however, were peculiarly horrible even for Paris. But the criminal himself was altogether a most remarkable man. He had formerly been an analytical chemist, and was a man of high intellectual attainments. In direct opposition, however, to the wishes of his friends and relations, he married a woman much below him in social rank, and one of very indifferent character. Such a mésalliance was, of course, bound to bring misery and unhappiness. Madame Thoreau had a violent temper and a most jealous disposition. The result was the ill-matched couple led a cat-and-dog life for years. At first the man struggled against his misfortunes, then he gave way to drink, and that brought the inevitable concomitant train of evils. He lost his position, his business, his honor, went from bad to worse, was deserted by all his relations, committed forgery, and served a long term of imprisonment. On his release, he sank down to the lowest stratum of society, and together with his wife and 4 children, found shelter in the dreadful Alsatia of Saint-Denis. Here he formed a liaison with a woman who lived under the same roof. For a time, the wife tolerated her rival, then the 2 women began to fight like wildcats until the feud ended in the awful tragedy. Thoreau, inflamed with wine, went to his den one night, when both the women reviled and reproached him, until, excited into a fit of frenzy, he slew them and his children. His history, such as I have sketched it in outline, was gradually unfolded at the trial, and, although he found some sympathizers, the weight of public opinion was decidedly against him. There was never from the first a shadow of a doubt about his being the culprit. The only question was whether, to their verdict, the jury could not append the extenuating circumstances of which French juries are so fond, and which invariably saves the murderer's head. But Thoreau's crime was so revolting and barbarous that the extenuating circumstances were left out, and the criminal was condemned to death without hope of reprieve. As soon as Dr. Grassard heard of the sentence, he said to me, "Well, young gentleman, I think we shall at last be able to try our experiments, and, what is more, we shall have an unusually good subject." I knew what he meant by an unusually good subject. Thoreau was a man of striking physical mold. From an anatomical point of view, he was perfect, with a well-shaped head, firmly set on massive shoulders. He was under 40, and had never had any disease, so that in such a man vitality would be very strong, and there would be a corresponding tenacity of life. Apart from sheer physical attributes, he was endowed with a keen intelligence and mental powers of a high order, though he had shown himself weak in one respect. That was his inability to rise superior to his misfortunes. Dr. Grassard's position as one of the first anatomists in France gave him great influence, so that he had no difficulty in obtaining permission from the authorities to visit the condemned man. He found Thoreau callous as to his fate, and holding views with regard to a future stage which rendered him deaf to the voice of spiritual consolation. As a matter of fact, he absolutely and determinedly refused to receive the prison or any other chaplain, though a day or two before his execution he so far relented as to consent to see a priest, to whom he made confession. It will be readily comprehended in what respect such a man was about as good a subject as could have been selected for our purpose. With tact and delicacy, Dr. Grassard led up to the purpose that had induced him to visit him, telling him that in the interest of science it was desired to make certain tests, with a view to endeavor to establish the precise moment when the death of the brain ensued after decapitation. With a grim smile, Thoreau said that as a chief actor in the experiment, he was perfectly willing to do all that he possibly could to further the ends of science. But he wanted to know what part he was to play after he was beheaded. He was told that what was desired of him was that at the moment when he was laid upon the plank, with his neck under the knife, he should concentrate all his thoughts upon 4 questions that would be spoken into his ear. These questions were: 1. Are you in pain? 2. Do you recognize those about you? 3. Do you remember what you have been guillotined for? 4. Are you happy? The affirmative answer to these questions was to be a single blink of the eyelids, the negative 2. Now, if consciousness remained for any appreciable space of time, there was no reason why this motion of the eyelids should not be made, because the palpebrae, or eyelids, are dependent for their action on certain muscles known as the orbicular, or circular muscles, and the levators palpebrae superiores, the muscles used to raise the upper eyelids, which would be quite uninjured structurally. The same remark applies to the muscles of the eye known as the recti, which are 6 in number, so that the eye might also be moved if the will was there. On that the whole question turned. Would the will be there? By will I mean consciousness. These preliminaries having been settled, it now remained to make arrangements for carrying the experiments out, and in this we were aided in every possible way by the authorities, the matter of course being kept strictly secret. In discussing these arrangements with Professor Grassard, I took the liberty to express myself to the effect that if the brain could be kept at its normal temperature by the blood, consciousness might be retained for many seconds, if not minutes, and what we had to consider was how to prevent the tremendous drain of the vital fluid as soon as the severance was accomplished. Naturally, with the cutting through the great veins and arteries, the blood flowed away as water would flow from a reservoir if the banks were to burst, and what we had to do was to dam this flow. After some consideration, Professor Grassard suggested that by plunging the bleeding surface into a basin of softened wax, the end aimed at would be attained. The month was November, and the morning of the execution was as dismal as could be imagined. All night long a drizzling rain had been falling, and a searching, biting wind made the streets unbearable. To this fact, no doubt, was due the comparatively small crowd that had assembled in a Place de Roquette, where the guillotine was erected. The hideous machine of death had been placed within 3 yards of the door of the prison through which its victim would have to pass on this his last journey. A corridor had been formed from the door to the steps of the guillotine by putting up a canvas screen on each side. This had been done for our special convenience. It had also been arranged that, instead of the basket which was to receive the head being placed on the scaffold in the usual way, some of the planks were cut, forming, as it were, a trap door, the basket being on the ground under the trap. Consequently, after the execution, the head could be taken out without the spectators having any knowledge of what was being done. The authorities were also good enough to place at our disposal an anteroom just inside of the corridor of the prison, so that we had no difficulty whatever in completing our preparations and being quite ready for the exciting moment. As is well known, culprits condemned to death in France are never informed of the day of their execution until the very morning, and only then about an hour before the time. It was 6 o'clock when the prefect, the governor of the prison, various officials, and a priest entered Thoreau's cell, and arousing him from a sound sleep, informed him that he had but an hour to live. The wretched man received the announcement with the most perfect sang-froid. There, turning to the priest, who had approached him with a crucifix, he bowed and said politely but firmly, "Monsieur, pardon me if I say I can dispense with your services. I have never attempted to deny I committed the crime, and now in this supreme hour, in your presence and the presence of these gentlemen, I confess that my hand, and my hand alone, killed the women and the children. I am perfectly aware that by the laws of my country my life is forfeited, and the perfect justice of my sentence I freely admit. But if such crimes as mine are to be visited with the wrath of heaven, I cannot hope to turn aside that wrath by a hurried prayer now that I am all but dead. Therefore, monsieur, I pray that you will leave me to my own reflections during the brief time left to me, for, as a matter of fact, I have pledged myself, so far as I can, to aid certain experiments that Professor Grassard is desirous of carrying out." This speech, at such a time, will show that the culprit was no ordinary man. The priest, however, did not retire, but remained with the prisoner and accompanied him to the scaffold, and there Thoreau consented to press his lips to the crucifix that the good priest extended to him. As soon as ever the mournful procession had passed through the doorway, one of our hospital assistants followed with a tin bowl half full of heated wax. A cordon of gendarmes was drawn around the guillotine, and beyond them again was a double line of mounted soldiers, so that the crowds of people were kept a long way off. Exactly 3 minutes after Thoreau had crossed the threshold of the door, he was lying on the plank. Daylight had scarcely yet begun to assert itself. From the murky sky the drizzling rain still descended, and away to the east there was an angry flush of red. The boom of the bell of Notre Dame, as it slowly tolled the hour of 7, fell on our ears as the gleaming and fatal knife flashed down the wooden uprights on which it worked, and Thoreau's head fell into the basket on the pavement. With extraordinary dexterity and coolness the assistant caught it up, and set it with the neck downward in the basin of wax, and then with agile movement he rushed into the room where we waited for him. The face of the culprit was then perfectly natural in its color and expression, but we noted that there was a slight twitching of the muscles of the mouth. The basin was set on a table already prepared, and in the full rays of a strong light. Then the professor placed his lips close to the right ear, and in a clear, deliberate, resonant voice asked, "Are you in pain?" Instantly there were 2 distinct blinks of the eyelids. "Do you recognize those about you?" the next asked. This time there was 1 blink. "Do you remember what you have been guillotined for?" 1 blink again, but now the muscular motion of the eyelid was perceptibly slower. The last question was then put, "Are you happy?" With the utterance of the word happy, Professor Grassard straightened himself up, and instantly the eyes, which were fully open, and also quite natural in color and expression, turned upon him. The effect of this was thrilling, and certainly would have unnerved men who had not been braced up by an enthusiastic love of science. The professor moved round the table slowly, describing the segment of a circle in his movement, and as he did so the eyes followed him. Then suddenly we saw a film come over them, and the lids drooped, while the face assumed a bluish-white tint, and there was a dropping of the lower jaw. From the time that the head was taken out of the basket to this change setting in, exactly 3 minutes 8 seconds had elapsed, as measured by a chronometer watch, so that there was consciousness of the brain for that period after the head was severed from the body. The proofs of this were beyond all question of possible doubt. It may of course be stated with positiveness that this, in a great measure, if not entirely so, was due to the hermetically sealing of the ends of the cut vessels by means of the wax. We regretted exceedingly that an answer by the sign of negation or affirmation, which had been agreed upon, had not been given to question number 4. It seemed probable that the question was understood, but instead of the motion of the eyelid, the eyes themselves turned, following the movement of the professor, and on discussing this subsequently, we came to the conclusion that it was due to Dr. Crawdad rising from the bent position he had assumed while speaking into the ear, and naturally he regretted that he had altered his position so quickly. The change in the face that then set in was probably due to the congesting of the sinuses, which would at once deprive the brain of all sensibility. In other words, the brain there and then died. This was the conclusion we arrived at, but nevertheless we resolved to try what effect an electric current might have, though we were actuated more by curiosity than any absolute idea of results. We had provided ourselves with a small battery, and laying bare the ganglion cervicale superioris, a nerve center in the neck, we sent a current through it, but the only effect produced was some twitching of the nerves of the face. We therefore made a deep incision down on the optic nerve behind the eye, and connecting the nerve with the positive pole of the battery, while the negative pole was applied to the base of the anterior lobe of the brain, we turned on the current. In a few seconds the face seemed to lose its bluish waxen appearance, and became suffused with a warm flush as in life. The eyes lost their glassiness, and the eyelids their droop. As we watched these phenomena with breathless interest, we saw with amazement the eyes move in a perfectly natural way from right to left and left to right. Then Professor Crawdad drew with his finger an imaginary line on a parallel axis to the eyes of the head, and the eyes slowly followed the motion of the finger. Speaking for myself, I confess to being positively startled by this unlooked-for result, for anything more weird or awful than the bodiless head rolling its eyes in counterfeit presentiment of actual life could hardly be imagined by a brain of man. But the climax had not yet been reached, for the next moment the professor brought his lips in a line with the right ear of the head, and in a clear, distinct voice said, "If you are conscious of what is being done, make that known to us by blinking your eyelids." I had been looking at the face intently as this was said, and I was now absolutely horrified to observe that the eyelids actually did blink. I could endure no more. I seemed to be suffocating. I staggered to the door, flung it open, and reaching the passage, fell down in a swoon. When I recovered consciousness, Professor Crawdad conveyed me to my residence in his carriage. I saw that he was very grave and thoughtful. "I think," he said quietly, as we neared our destination, "I think our experiments went a little beyond what we intended, for we seem to have brought the dead to life again." "Yes," I answered with a shudder, "and we have substantiated my theory that the head of a human being may live for some minutes after its severance from the body, but nothing would ever induce me to undertake such experiments again." End of Some Experiments with a Head. Recording by Jim Gallagher.